For more on this, we're joined by Asia One correspondent Nick Harper, reporting live from Washington, D.C. So, Nick, President Donald Trump has met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. What were the key outcomes of their meeting?
That's right. That meeting now wrapped up about 30 minutes ago. The two men spent about an hour within the White House walls, a meeting in the Oval Office, and some other talks with other advisors during that visit. Really the main thing that President Zelenskyy was here to petition the US president for were more missiles, specifically interceptor Patriot missiles. Something really Ukraine, desperate as it is, continuing to see really a barrage of Russian rockets being fired at the country almost on a daily basis. And those interceptor missiles is something that the country has been running low on. Now, when the two leaders met a few weeks ago at the NATO summit in Ankara, the US president pledged to give Ukraine the license for the US-made Patriot interceptor missiles. And really that was part of today's meeting. President Zelenskyy posted on social media afterwards saying that it had been a good meeting and saying that they had discussed those Patriot interceptor missiles and the production of them. He also said they talked about several other ideas that could help Ukraine. The thinking is that that could be about getting more drones for the country to aid in its efforts against the might of the Russian military. Really, President Zelenskyy here to try and shore up support from the US leader, because during Donald Trump's return to the White House since January last year, we have seen the US leader really go back and forth about how much support he wants to give Ukraine. He has been worried about giving away US military hardware to the Ukrainians to help in their fight against Russia. And part of today's meeting, therefore, was really to try and win around the US leader, to try and get him on side, to shore up that support and get more commitments from Washington that the US is committed to try and help Ukraine in that fight against Russia.
So, Nick, President Donald Trump is also expected to meet Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. What are the main issues expected to be discussed between Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump?
That's right. The two leaders, of course, have been engaged in that conflict against Iran since the end of February. We saw really a ceasefire take place and then fall apart within days. The resumption of military activity lasting 13 days between the US and Iran, that coming to a halt just a few days ago. Really part of what the Israeli leader has been hoping to urge the US president about is trying to resume that military activity against Iran, to hit it harder and to try and expand operations against the Iranians. But the US president has been receiving advice in the last few days from his own administration, including from the Vice President J.D. Vance, that really it's time to cool it on that military activity, partly because the US is running low on its stockpile of missiles that it has been using to fire on the Iranians. We've heard from the Pentagon on that as well, and there is some concern within military circles that really those stockpiles are getting very, very low. And if the US continues the military activity, it will put it in a very difficult position, potentially to defend itself in the future months in case it ever needs to. But really the Israeli leader wants a ramping up of that conflict. So he's trying to win over the US president, to convince him that really this is a time not for peace and diplomacy and pulling back, but rather ramping up that military aggression against the Iranians. We're also told that there has been some Israeli intelligence in recent days suggesting that the Iranians are continuing nuclear production at one of their facilities, and also some Israeli intelligence suggesting that the Iranians are lying when they say that they want a peace deal. All of those things the Israeli Prime Minister hoping to convey to the US President in that meeting, which is currently still taking place in the White House behind me.
So, Nick, US-Israel ties have also seen some recent differences. Could those issues maybe shape today's meeting between President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu?
Well, I think it certainly could, and I think what we've seen in recent weeks is the tide turning against the Israeli leader. If we think back over recent months, since Donald Trump returned to the White House more than a year and a half ago, there really had been that rock-solid support from the US leader for the Israeli Prime Minister. But that has changed in recent weeks. There have been reports that the two, when they spoke, on the phone at one point, had a very acrimonious conversation. There was some bad language used between the two of them. And I think part of that has created these strained relations, because both men seem to want different things. The fact that the Israeli leader wants to continue the fight against Iran, the fact that the US president is being cautioned against that, all of that is creating friction between the two leaders. And we have seen the US president over the course of the last 24 hours in an interview with Fox News really expressing his displeasure at the Israeli leader, suggesting that those cracks are beginning to show, and that very warm relationship which they had a year and a half ago has certainly changed. Just bear in mind that this is the first face-to-face meeting between the two leaders since the beginning of the Iran conflict at the end of February, and I think really it'll be very telling what we hear out of this meeting, whether the US president posts something on social media, as he likes to do, or whether the Israeli leader decides to speak to the media. It is a closed-door meeting, so we don't get a chance to see that body language, that interaction between the two men. So really it's about what comes after that meeting that I think will give some hints about how it went.
So Nick, many people demonstrated against the war on Iran before and after Netanyahu landed on the US soil. Now, can we now say that public opposition to the war can maybe push Donald Trump to maybe end the war or extend a pause?
Well, potentially, yes. And I've been on this rooftop over the last couple of hours. We've been able to hear those protesters on the streets just outside of the White House, of course, being kept back outside of the security perimeter, not getting too close to the leader. But I think that shows the level of displeasure that many Americans do feel about this conflict, the fact that it has dragged on for months when the US president initially said it would be ended within the course of just weeks. Americans who think back to recent history have been scarred by those forever wars with Iraq and Afghanistan, and really not wanting to see US intervention in the Middle East again. That concern has been at the top of many Americans' minds, and we have seen poll after poll during this conflict really showing that the majority of Americans do not agree with the conflict, and certainly don't agree with it being a long and protracted conflict. They want the US president to try and find a diplomatic solution, some sort of exit, an off-ramp out of this conflict. And of course it was hoped by some Americans that that was going to happen during that ceasefire period when it was all about negotiations and talks between the US and Iran. That really hasn't come to pass, and that's why we're still seeing people out on the streets showing their dissatisfaction about this continued conflict that really shows no sign of ending.
Nick Harper, thank you so much for being with us.